Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Thank you all for joining us today for our event on U.S. policy toward Taiwan. I'm Bonnie Glaser, Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. When the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979, it created a framework for preserving strong ties with our former treaty ally, Taiwan. And that framework included the Taiwan Relations Act, One China policy, and later the recently declassified Six Assurances were added. And in the subsequent decades, as Taiwan became a full-fledged democracy, the US-Taiwan relationship got even stronger. Today, US-Taiwan relations are closer and more robust than ever. Bipartisan support for Taiwan in the US Congress has reached unprecedented levels. And Americans generally view Taiwan as a trusted partner to the United States and a responsible stakeholder on global challenges such as COVID-19. We did a poll at CSIS, which we released last week, and one of the questions we asked respondents was how important it is for the United States to defend Taiwan should it come under attack from China. And on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning it's not worth taking any risk, and 10 meaning it's worth taking a significant risk, the mean score of the American public was 6.69, and that was just slightly below the mean score for backing US allies Japan and South Korea. And among thought leaders, it was even higher, it was almost 8. Taiwan has been under threat from China. As we know, since 1949, when the nationalists were defeated on the mainland and retreated to the island. In recent years, however, that threat has intensified, and it's expanded across military, political, social, and economic domains. Gray zone threats like disinformation and cyber attacks have increased. No matter who wins the presidential election next month, U.S. support for Taiwan is likely to remain strong. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen has proven to be a reliable U.S. partner. She's pursuing prudent, cautious policies to manage pressure from the PRC, to bolster Taiwan's economy, and, importantly, to strengthen its defense. Going forward, U.S. policy toward Taiwan will have to be framed within the larger context of this new era of strategic competition with China. And that will bring both increased risks and opportunities, not only for Taiwan, but also for the United States and the broader Indo-Pacific region. So with this context in mind, CSIS established a bipartisan task force last January to assess the efficacy of the US policy framework toward Taiwan and to prepare recommendations for the coming 4 years and beyond. Our task force includes senior officials from prior administrations, as well as experts on national security, business, trade, technology, law, and human rights. And on behalf of the other task force co-chairs, Mike Green and Richard Bush, who are joining us today for this event, I'd like to thank all the task force members for their commitment and their contribution to the report. In addition, I'd like to thank the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Representative Office for their generous support for this project. The findings and recommendations represent the consensus of our 16-member task force and were not influenced by our funders. So our report includes numerous specific policy recommendations for an administration led by either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Our event today will proceed as follows. First, my colleague, Dr. Michael Green, who is Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS, will discuss why Taiwan matters to the United States. And he will be followed by Dr. Richard Bush, who is non-resident senior fellow in the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. And he's going to talk about the context and policy recommendations in the areas of economics and diplomacy, people-to-people ties, and Congress. And then I'll conclude by discussing the report's policy recommendations on defense and international organizations. And after that, we're going to leave time to take your questions. So I hope that you will send in your questions. You can submit them by going to our event page at csis.org, click on Ask Live Questions here, or you can send an email to hprice, H-P-R-I-C-E, at csis.org. And please include your name and affiliation along with your questions. So I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Mike Green, to talk about why Taiwan matters to the United States.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. It was a real pleasure working on this task force with Richard and with Bonnie, who both bring considerable experience and wisdom to U.S. Asia policy, and particularly policy towards Taiwan, and with the members of this bipartisan task force. We in the task force opened by explaining why Taiwan's status and success matters to the United States. And in some ways, I suspect for our audience, we don't need to state that, but we thought it was important to state for two reasons. One is we believe Taiwan is important to the United States beyond the Taiwan Strait and in the context of broader US values and geopolitical objectives, well beyond East Asia. And also, we thought it was important to state why Taiwan matters because, as the CSIS survey Bonnie cited demonstrates, there is a growing recognition, particularly among thought leaders across all sectors, not just Asia scholars, but business leaders, agriculture. There is a growing recognition that there's something very special and important about Taiwan right now in the context of geopolitical competition with China, but also COVID-19 and many of the challenges we face. So we enumerated a series of US interests in Taiwan's future and began with democratic values. Many governments, not just the United States government, in Europe and Australia and Japan, are noting in official documents that the 21st century is increasingly being defined by a systemic competition between capitalist democracy and an authoritarian state-led economic model. In Japan, Western Europe, Australia, Korea, Canada, many subscribe to this, but particularly Taiwan represents that democratic capitalist model. And Taiwan sits at the front line, at the fault line in this competition of ideas. And Taiwan's democracy is particularly important right now because of the contrasting example of Hong Kong, where the national security law in Beijing was followed by an unprecedented crackdown and diminishment of Hong Kong's autonomy. But it stood in such a contrast to the election in Taiwan around the same time period. A free, fair election, and importantly, an election that featured interference from the PRC through social media and other cyber tools. Taiwan succeeded. It had a peaceful and very successful democratic election. And that is not only an example to us on how to preserve our democracies in the face of considerable pressure, but it's also an example for the rest of Asia. Second, Taiwan is important, has always been important, but is again increasingly becoming important in the context of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Bonnie described, and we'll come back to, the increasing military pressure on Taiwan from the PRC. Taiwan's geography matters. Taiwan is in the middle of the first island chain. Successful coercion against Taiwan would break the island chain, would cut off Japan, would separate Australia. This has been a basic American geopolitical consideration for more than 70 years. And successful coercion would diminish confidence, if not kill confidence, in the American security commitment to Japan, to Korea, to others. So I don't think any of us on the task force think that we are looking at an imminent Chinese attack, but the gray zone coercion, the pressure on Taiwan from China, which parallels pressure on India and Japan and other peripheral states, it matters to the larger geopolitical peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And finally, the future of Taiwan is important to American competitiveness economically and prosperity. Taiwan, of course, is the 9th largest trading partner for the United States. And in the areas of fiercest technological competition, particularly 5G and the Internet of Things, Taiwan is a leader with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, in the front lines of innovation and also in the front lines of competition with China. So we talk more in the trade and economic and technology section of the report about how we can leverage Taiwan's technological strengths in rulemaking and negotiations to have a greater set of data reciprocity, secure digital networks, and so forth. We touched briefly on the framework for US policy on Taiwan. And when I was the senior director for Asia, this was the beginning of every briefing for President George W. Bush. I'm sure Richard had similar experiences. At one point, the president had heard the canonical text so many times, he joked that perhaps he should just have a laminated card he could hand to Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin to remind him that we remember the framework. But any strategic review, any policy review like ours requires you to go back and look at that framework for policy and how durable it is. And we went through it in the report, you'll see, and we started with the Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA. And we started with that because it is a matter of United States law, unlike other aspects of our framework for Taiwan. And because in the current environment, the US support for Taiwan, expressed and codified in the Taiwan Relations Act, deserves the greatest attention in our strategy, in our view. But no diminishment in the importance of the 3 communiques, or the so-called One China policy, set in the 72 Shanghai Communique, 79 Communique during the Carter administration establishing normal relations, and then the 82 Communique with the Reagan administration. We saw no reason to change the basic parameters set by those 3 communiques, recognizing that they were communiques. They were not treaties, they were not US law. We saw no reason to adjust those in any significant way, and saw utility in keeping them as a stabilizing framework for US policy. And then the 6 assurances, which were declassified by the State Department as we were writing this report. And we think they're incredibly important. Not every senior US policymaker, even in the Asia space, knows about the 3 assurances, which were promulgated in 1982 by the Reagan administration to reassure Taiwan and to discipline the US government that we will not engage in negotiations about arms sales or Taiwan's future with Beijing. We will respect the people of Taiwan and their decision. Critically important, and I'm glad, and I think most of our task force members are glad the State Department declassified it. Finally, we flagged the April 2004 statement of Assistant Secretary of State James Kelly. I was in the administration at the time, where he stated that the United States opposes unilateral moves that would change the status quo as we define it. That gives us flexibility. The concern at the time, frankly, was Chen Shui-bian, who was pushing the envelope on definitions of Taiwan status. But I would say in the current environment, it applies much more to Beijing's moves and coercive moves. So this framework gives us a durable, predictable, because predictability is important in a delicate situation like this, predictable but flexible framework. And there are issues now coming up. Richard Haas at CFR has said perhaps we should end strategic ambiguity and have strategic clarity. We would defend Taiwan. And we, in the report, said we don't think that's quite the solution, but we do need to consider how we can use this framework in our declaratory policy in the context of other measures that we'll discuss to enhance security for Taiwan and stability in the Western Pacific and the First Island chain. We can come back to that. I suspect there will be questions, but thank you, Bonnie. I'll turn it over to Richard next.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you all of you in Cyberland who have joined us for this meeting. At the outset, I'd like to commend Bonnie Glaser for her leadership in undertaking this project and for displaying her usual energy and dedication to see it through to the end. Bonnie has a number of colleagues at CSIS who contributed to the project in various ways. I cannot stress the importance of this project too much. As far as we know, the last time an expert group looked at Taiwan was in 1995, a very different time. A new study is long overdue. The existential nature of the challenge that Taiwan faces is becoming more apparent, and thus the importance of our bilateral relationship is becoming more important. The challenge, of course, comes from China. The root of that challenge, as we know, is that Chinese leaders are stubbornly sticking to their one country, two systems approach to resolving cross-strait differences. They are refusing to accept the reality that Taiwan has a democratic system and that the people will have a say. Although the people of Taiwan clearly oppose one country, two systems, Beijing has not adjusted policy accordingly. And seeing that it can't get what it wants through persuasion, the PRC has turned to coercion. Now, my job is to talk about economic relations and diplomatic interactions. On the economic relationship, there's no need for me to review its importance. You can read the report. I do want to highlight a basic mismatch, and that is that the US-Taiwan security and diplomatic relationship is strong, yet since Taiwan's entry into the WTO in 2002, the economic relationship has been in stalemate. One would think that it would be in the American interest to help Taiwan strengthen its economy and so strengthen it overall, but that's not the case. US policy is bifurcated. This incoherence did not begin with the Trump administration, but it has become more obvious in recent years. The task force therefore concluded that strengthening US-Taiwan economic ties is key to bolstering Taiwan's overall security and prosperity and enhancing Taiwan's confidence in the US commitment. Over the past year, there have been growing calls for an end to this stalemate, specifically calls for negotiating a bilateral trade agreement. Such an agreement would open markets, reduce Taiwan's marginalization from the international economy, a product of PRC diplomacy. But over the long run, a BTA with its array of policy disciplines would also stimulate structural adjustment in Taiwan's economy, and that is long overdue. Now, we understand that jumpstarting a BTA has been impossible because of the dispute over American beef and pork. President Tsai on August 28th, in an act of political courage, removed that obstacle. So the ball is now in the US court. A leading recommendation of our report, in light of all this, is that the two governments should begin exploratory talks for a BTA with the goal of launching formal negotiations as soon as possible. This will be a complex undertaking, in part because some provisions of a BTA will require congressional legislation to effectively carry them out, and the report gives details of that matter. Now, in the economic sphere, there's emerged another issue that is important to Washington. That is Taiwan's role in critical supply chains and geoeconomic policies. This issue is particularly salient with respect to advanced sensitive technologies, and Taiwan is an innovator of technologies such as semiconductors. The Trump administration's changes in technology policy towards China have had a major impact on Taiwan's high-tech sector, particularly semiconductor manufacturing. The impact on Taiwan firms of putting Huawei on the entities list is only the most clear-cut example. Now, restricting China's access to high-tech can be an important tool in America's strategic competition with China. But Taiwan's companies should not suffer collateral damage from that policy. When we fight on the high-tech front, we need to fight smart. Therefore, the Trump administration's actions underscore the need for better consultations and coordination of policy. And the report advocates bringing Taiwan into plurilateral discussions on export controls, cybersecurity, and IT supply chains. Turning to diplomacy and cooperation, within the context of our unofficial relationship, Beijing and Taipei have expanded the breadth and depth of their interactions in recent years. The report has a good inventory of those. Our diplomacy, of course, is not confined to bilateral matters, but increasingly expanded to include multilateral issues and Taiwan's role in the world. One reason our relationship is in such good shape is that senior officials in Washington and Taipei have generally adhered to an unwritten set of rules of the road for maintaining productive relations. The framework of that relationship has enabled Taiwan to prosper, remain secure, and consolidate democratic institutions. And as Beijing has increased pressure on Taiwan, Washington has adjusted that framework, providing stronger support. In passing, I cannot stress too strongly the importance of the American Institute in Taiwan in facilitating and broadening the broadening and deepening of our interaction. Everyone who works at AIT's magnificent new building, a symbol of the US commitment to the island, brings intelligence and dedication to their work every day, and that's good for Taiwan. Although the conduct of the US-Taiwan relationship has broadened and deepened in recent years, opportunities exist for further expansion. A key recommendation of the report is that our two sides strengthen opportunities for communication between senior officials. Another is that Congress review the financial support provided to the American Institute in Taiwan to ensure that it has the resources it needs. I would also mention people-to-people ties. I recently learned about how the Fulbright program in Taiwan brings smart, dedicated American young people to Taiwan to teach English in out-of-the-way places all over the island, places that don't see Americans. This is very good for the individuals involved. It's very good for our relationship. Let me talk a little bit about Congress. Historically, Taiwan saw Congress as the main defender of its interests in the US government. In recent years, as US and Taiwan interests converge, the engagement between the two executive branches has become more wide-ranging and fruitful. Even so, congressional focus on Taiwan remains strong. This interest is a good thing. The more that members of Congress are exposed to Taiwan and understand Taiwan, the better. Taiwan's engagement with state and local governments is also important. Now, Taiwan has welcomed the many pieces of recent legislation as symbols of American backing. Correctly, these measures have not sought to bind the executive branch or to act or change policies. If legislation went further than that, it could risk creating elevated expectations of American support for Taiwan. Non-binding legislative signaling on Taiwan that pushes beyond existing US policy also carries the risk of doing more harm than good. On balance, however, in the commercial and diplomatic areas, we are doing very well. There are ways we could do a lot better, and I hope this report will stimulate them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. Let me just say a few things about the defense and international organizations portion of our report. Obviously, the military balance across the strait has increasingly tilted toward China. And the mainland's rapid economic growth, its increased defense spending, multi-decade PLA modernization efforts have eroded Taiwan's traditional advantages, its technological superiority, and the inherent geographic defenses that Taiwan has as an island. China's development of an array of anti-access area denial capabilities has complicated US military plans to intervene in the event of a Chinese invasion or blockade. So our task force was united in the assessment that deterrence needs to be strengthened. And as Mike Green mentioned, there were differences over whether the US should make an unambiguous commitment to come to Taiwan's defense, what has been referred to by some as strategic clarity. But we all agreed that effective deterrence requires more than public statements, no matter how clear. Above all, it requires improving US capabilities to ensure that America's ability to intervene is credible. And we have a broad set of options as a country for intervention. And it's also necessary, of course, to bolster Taiwan's capabilities to defend itself, not only against the threat of invasion, but also against China's expanding toolkit of gray zone threats that are aimed at undermining the confidence of the Taiwan public in its government. So we call for sustained efforts by both the US and Taiwan, unilaterally, but also jointly, to strengthen our ability to deter Chinese aggression and coercion. Just last week, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien called on Taiwan to turn itself into a porcupine. He said, since lions don't like to eat porcupines. That analogy can actually be traced at least to 2008, when Bill Murray, a professor at the Naval War College, issued a clarion call for Taiwan to fortify itself. And this task is getting more urgent. Our report primarily focuses, of course, on US policy toward Taiwan, but we also called for Taipei to invest more resources in its defense and prioritize asymmetric and anti-access area denial strategies in its procurement, development of operational concepts, and in its training. So in the defense realm, we do call for the next administration to reaffirm in a high-level public statement that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait are essential for US interests and that they are matters of international concern. We also call for a high-level interagency review of Taiwan's security, including PRC capabilities and intentions, and ways that the US and Taiwan should respond. And based on that review, we think it's imperative to develop a new set of tools to strengthen deterrence and to better shape the intentions of PRC leaders. Another recommendation that we make is to launch a Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which would be an analog to what already exists for Europe, to address the eroding military balance in the Pacific and provide congressional funding to that end. One of the recommendations that I think is particularly important is to help train civilian defense experts in Taiwan and to encourage Taiwan's civil society organizations to establish institutions outside of the Ministry of Defense to engage in independent defense analysis. Lastly, in the defense area, we call for establishing a program like the US National Guard State Partnership Program to directly engage Taiwan's Reserve Command, as this has become a very high priority, and President Tsai Ing-wen has talked about the need to rebuild the reserves. So very briefly, in international organizations area, promoting Taiwan's participation in the international community and international organizations benefits the United States by leveraging Taiwan's contribution to international public goods, reducing Taiwan's isolation, and adding a voice that often aligns with US interests. So to this end, the US should develop creative ways, and to some extent, we already have the Global Cooperation Training Framework being one example. But we need to work hard to expand Taiwan's role in international organizations, especially where Taiwan has expertise that can benefit the international community. Of course, front and center in this is global health, and Taiwan's performance in spreading in preventing the spread of COVID-19. And gaining real control over this in Taiwan, it provides an exemplar for all nations around the world. Taiwan should rejoin a reformed World Health Organization, and the US should more effectively support Taiwan's bid to regain its observer status in the World Health Assembly. And we need to strengthen coalitions with like-minded countries and take joint actions to expand Taiwan's participation. So one of the specific recommendations that we make is that the US should encourage G7 members to issue a joint statement supporting Taiwan's reinstatement as observer in the WHA. There's many more recommendations in the report. Our recommendation section alone is 7 pages long, but we really wanted to provide some very specific, meaty, actionable recommendations for the next administration across a broad range of issues. So my colleagues and I have touched on some of these today, but we have left half of our time, I'm very pleased to say, to address questions from our listeners, and we've already received some. I want to start before going to the first question, just repeating how you can submit your question. So you can go to our event page at csis.org and you can click on Ask Live Questions here, or you can email to hprice, H-P-R-I-C-E, at csis.org, and please include your name and affiliation. So let me start with the first question. We've had several questions from listeners and also those in advance who submitted their questions about the policy of the next administration, whether it be a second Trump administration or whether it be a Biden administration. So I'd like to just combine these into one question as to what the differences might be, where policy towards Taiwan might go in the future, how it might change, what continuity we might seek. So who would like to begin? All right, Mike, over to you.
Thank you. So I think that U.S. policy towards Taiwan and Japan is going to be one of the foreign policy areas where you see the least change, depending on the election. And I say that because, as our CSIS survey showed, there's quite robust public and elite support for defending Taiwan, and also, Bonnie didn't mention it, but very robust support for democracy and human rights, where Taiwan is an important a symbol and a bastion in the Western Pacific. So it's quite bipartisan. There are over 200 bills in Congress on China this session. I think 12 or 13 have passed, but with broad bipartisan support. So I don't think that aspect changes as much. I personally believe that President Trump's style has created some real questions in Taiwan, but also in Korea and Japan, about whether at the end of the day he really would come to Taiwan's defense. He's famously transactional. He's threatened to pull troops out of Korea. I think that aspect would change with the Biden administration. You would have a somewhat more predictable, steady, less transactional approach, and I think that would be welcomed. But Bonnie, in our survey, we asked in the region, which candidate is better for your country on China policy? Joe Biden won handily, especially in Europe. In Asia, Vietnamese and Indian experts said Trump would be better, which is interesting because they're on the front lines of Chinese coercion. And in Taiwan, it was pretty close. Biden just barely got the edge among the several dozen foreign policy experts we surveyed. So a Biden administration carries with it a little bit of the baggage of previous Democratic administrations' debates on Taiwan. I personally think, and Richard, I think will agree with this, those debates are largely over. There's a bipartisan consensus about Taiwan policy, but a little bit of branding problem for a Biden administration to attend to with respect to how it will approach China. This is not the Clinton or Obama administrations, because the leader in China is not Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, it's Xi Jinping. And I think the Democratic establishment on foreign policy has fundamentally changed. But there's a bit of a branding issue for a Biden administration. So that's sort of how I see it, based in large part on the survey we did, and being not affiliated with either campaign.
I agree with all of Mike's points, not surprisingly. I share his report about the concerns of our friends in Asia, including on Taiwan, about the credibility of U.S. defense commitments under the Trump administration. I think that would change under a Biden administration. Mike is right also that China policy will set something of a context for Taiwan policy. I do think that a Biden administration will be more rigorous in the way it formulates policy. And it will look much more like how previous administrations have decided what are US interests and what we should do to promote them. One final point, Joe Biden, I think, is the only person in public life today who voted for the Taiwan Relations Act. I suspect that he remembers that vote and that he still finds it meaningful today. Thanks.
Great. Richard, let me ask you to explain briefly. This is a question from Dylan Thomas at the Air University of Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. How does the declassification of the 6 assurances change US-Taiwan relations? So could you say something about why?
How did the declassification of what?
Declassification of the 6 assurances. Why does this matter? Why is it important?
It doesn't matter in terms of our knowledge of the 6 assurances and what was in them, because even at the time, the content of them was revealed to Congress and others. This just confirms what we already knew. I do think that the assurances that were conveyed at that time remain important for Taiwan as an expression of the US commitment. And so to go through the formal act of declassification is a way of reinforcing the importance of those commitments, even though we knew what they were.
For you, Mike, question from Adam Liff, a professor at Indiana University. How would you evaluate the depth and breadth of US-Japan coordination on Taiwan policy today? And given the developments in cross-strait relations, particularly since 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen came to power, how important is closer coordination between the US and Japan in the years ahead?
It's incredibly important. I think Taiwan is Japan's best friend in Northeast Asia and maybe Asia overall, certainly on a popular and cultural level. The relations are obviously bad with China and North Korea, but they're not great with South Korea. And I think Taiwan and Japan have a uniquely close and positive relationship. But Japan spent most of its post-war history avoiding entanglement in US-Taiwan policy and entanglement in the defense of Taiwan. And Adam writes quite authoritatively on these issues, but in 1969, in exchange for returning Okinawa, President Nixon wanted the Japanese side to agree to defend Taiwan. And he got a vague statement in the 1969 communique, and then Japan did nothing. And in 1998, when the US and Japan revised the defense guidelines to allow cooperation in situ areas in the area around Japan that affect Japan's security, obviously Taiwan, there was another obstacle, which was Japan's ban on collective self-defense. Well, in 2015, and Adam has written about this very well, Prime Minister Abe changed that. Japan no longer has that obstacle. And I think bilateral US-Japan planning and coordination on security scenarios involving the Taiwan Strait are by far more extensive than they have ever been. And I suspect that the PLA in its planning assumes that almost under any scenario, Japan is in. And that's a huge deterrent effect that's important and helpful for Taiwan. But of course, the Taiwan-Japan leg of the relationship has not advanced at all over this period. Japan has no Taiwan Relations Act, and official limits and interactions are prescribed, and they're not going to loosen up a lot because although the Abe and Asuga governments are working very closely with the US on the China problem, they're also trying to manage economic investment in relation with China. And so I think we'll have to be creative. And, we're talking about 1.5 track dialogues on strategy. We're talking about retired military increasing their coordination and strategic thinking, and increasing cooperation in areas like infrastructure finance, where the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, is doing things with Taiwan in the Pacific Islands. But that is becoming a mismatch, the Japan-Taiwan leg, at a time when the US and Japan are much more vigorously preparing for a variety of scenarios around Asia.
Great. Well, we have a question about the KMT from Sean King at Park Strategies. And I'll pose this to Richard, and I'd like to broaden the question a little bit because the question is really about the KMT's recent LY, the resolutions it introduced in the legislative yuan, which are aimed at strengthening ties with the United States. And also about its decision to not attend the Straits Forum this year in Xiamen. But that's very specific. And so I'd really like to broaden it to ask you about the state of the KMT and how that impacts US interests in Taiwan. So where do you see this going forward, and how will US interests be affected if the KMT remains fractured and perhaps weakened in its influence in Taiwan?
I'll start with an anecdote. In 2000, right after Chen Shui-bian won the election, there was growing pessimism about the future of the KMT, and I, in my official mode, said, don't count the KMT out. It's a very resilient party, and in 2008, they proved me right. And I think they are a resilient party. They have some time to get their act together. They do face difficult challenges. There is a generational gap between the Ma Ying-jeou generation and that of current chairman Johnny Chiang, and they need to work through the differences between those two. There is an even greater problem on how they strike a balance between being an alternative to the DPP on China, having a somewhat more China-friendly approach, and at the same time maintaining public support. That's another thing they have to work through. I don't rule out the possibility that they can do it. And perhaps it might include some messages to the PRC to lighten up a little bit and go back to thinking about the hearts and minds of the Taiwan people. But this is a big challenge, but the KMT has some talented people, and the public in Taiwan sooner or later gets tired of the party in power and tries for an alternative. So they still have hope.
Great. So a question from William Howard, New York University, Shanghai, is about the cyber issue and the threats that Taiwan faces from China in the cyber realm. Part of the question is, has the frequency of attacks in the cyber area gone up? The answer to that is, of course, yes. And Taiwan has talked publicly. You can look up the number of attacks, and we've seen this on the rise. But I want to pose the rest of the question to Mike. So how does this affect deterrence in the Taiwan Strait? Maybe add to that, what more should the United States be doing to respond to this growing threat?
So as you know, Bonnie, and Richard knows, the election in Taiwan featured major interference from the mainland. And the forensics strongly suggest that the initial campaigns in social media using advanced techniques like bots and so forth was aimed at building support for the KMT candidate to defeat Tsai Ing-wen. And that didn't work because, you know, while Beijing was doing that with one hand, with the other hand, they were cracking down in Hong Kong. And so once it became clear that Tsai Ing-wen would win, the campaign appeared to shift and in many ways looked more like Russian strategies with the US, which is to sow dissatisfaction and dissent with Taiwan's democracy, with the government's performance, to basically mess with society. I don't know if you two guys agreed, but I found that disturbingly similar to what we're seeing with the Russians. On the other hand, the government in Taipei did a really quite outstanding job protecting their democracy and their election system. And it certainly gave me a lot of confidence and made me think there's a lot we could learn from how Taiwan handled that. I'm personally more worried about cyber in a military context, cyber warfare. And all of our allies, including NATO and Japan, are struggling to keep up with the US as we ramp up our own cyber capabilities. And this is one of the many areas where Taiwan, for its own deterrence and defense, it needs more capability and needs an all of government. Because in that case, we're not talking about interference in society or politics. We're talking about denial of service and destructive attacks through cyberspace to cripple the country and coerce it. And there, I think Taiwan probably at A+ on the election side, but still very incomplete on the defense side in terms of cyber capabilities, all of government approaches. It's not just Taiwan, Japan, a lot of countries are working on this, trying to catch up, but it's an area where there needs to be more work, I think.
Bonnie, if I could quickly add to Mike's excellent answer. I think that Beijing's current strategy is sort of between war and accommodation. It's coercion without violence. And there are things that China could do to Taiwan's critical infrastructure of a rather temporary nature, but still have a huge psychological effect. And the psychology of the civilian population really is Taiwan's center of gravity. So if you could cause an all-island blackout for a few hours and then say, you know, we can do this anytime, get over it, it has an effect.
I want to turn to the economic realm and ask a question from Ramtanu Maitra, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, who is an independent analyst. And he's asked about the impact on Taiwan's economy of the growing tension between Taiwan and China. And of course, we could add to that the reshoring of some manufacturing plants, the effort by the Trump administration to pull supply chains out of China, companies like TSMC getting caught in the middle of that. So are you concerned about the implications then for Taiwan's economy, and are there measures that you suggest that we take in maybe in addition to what we've talked about, a bilateral trade agreement, but perhaps there are other steps we should take in order to strengthen Taiwan's economy and its resiliency. And I would note that Taiwan's exports continue, about 40% of them, to go to the mainland Hong Kong and Macau, despite, I think, efforts to reduce that. And so does that remain a vulnerability? Richard, you want to start with that?
I'll give it a shot. First of all, we need to distinguish between the Taiwan economy as in the form of the government and Taiwan companies. Taiwan companies have a lot more flexibility than the Taiwan government. If there's an RCEP in East Asia, Taiwan companies can go behind those tariff walls to not be excluded. Second, I think both the Ma administration and the Tsai administration understood that they shouldn't put all their economic eggs in a China basket, that they needed to expand their ties with other trading partners. And the proposal for a BTA is one product of that. I would also say that there's a lot of things that Taiwan can do for itself in advance, excuse me, of potential BTA with the United States. Taiwan could use a good bit of financial deregulation to allow the resources that exist on the island to go to productive purposes that they're not going to now. And in the process, employ the sort of legions of smart young people who are waiting for a better job than being a barista at a coffee shop.
So Taiwan is actually not so unique in this dilemma. I think Japanese and Korean companies, and to a significant extent, US companies, face a similar dilemma. in our survey, of course, Bonnie, there was very robust support among experts in the US and Japan and Korea and Taiwan for preventing Huawei and other Chinese firms from coming into our telecommunications networks, especially with 5G and the coming Internet of Things. So on defense, actually, Taiwan's position is quite aligned with the US and Japan, Korea. And these are important because these are the other major semiconductor powerhouses and technology powerhouses. When it comes to export controls and, the administration's entities list, which is very, very strict on exporting to 100 different Chinese tech companies, including Huawei, companies like TSMC are in the same boat as Sony or SK in Korea or some US companies. They find that those are far too restrictive. And so I think Taiwan is doing what Japan and Korea are doing. They're maintaining some capability in China for the China market, and then they're setting up separate supply chains, increasingly in Vietnam. So this points to something we have not done and could do, which is a digital trade agreement. I think the natural countries would be the US and Japan, Canada, Australia, but Taiwan would be part of this and can be part of it. It's not a broad liberalizing agreement in the WTO context, but it could set rules and set up some common practices on export controls and some common practices on inward investment in these high-tech areas. And Vietnam would be an important part of it because Vietnam is the destination for high-tech investment from Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and Vietnam is not going to allow Huawei into its market. So there's a configuration of countries and economies. Taiwan should absolutely be part of it. And that's an opportunity for us to do some rulemaking. The State Department has tried with this clean network to create a kind of safe space, but it's not sticking. There's concern in other countries. They'd lose in a WTO case if China challenged them because it's kind of a cartel. It was rolled out kind of unilaterally. The other countries didn't really get much of a say in what it looks like. I think whoever wins, we have a chance to do a bit of a mulligan, start over and start building a coalition primarily in Asia, primarily of high-tech countries, but also Vietnam, for example, to set up this kind of regulatory and rulemaking framework. And you can't do it without Taiwan. You just can't. So it's a great opportunity. I think waiting for TPP is as much as we all support it, it's going to be a while before the politics align for us to come back to TPP or something like it. But this is more realistic and in some ways higher impact.
Another question from Jean Detroyer from Global Commerce Education. It may seem highly unlikely today, but if the Taiwanese people were to vote to join the mainland, without any details of what that would mean, would the U.S. accept that decision? And I'm sure, Richard, that at some points along in your career, that seemed a little bit more likely than it seems today. But if you were to look into your crystal ball and maybe circumstances arise that becomes possible, I think that would be interesting to hear your response to that.
To start, the share of people who want unification either right now or sometime in the future is fractional. It's about 20%. So this is not a burning issue. And the word unification is not even defined, so we don't know. But the reality on the ground is changing in East Asia, so one cannot assume that the status quo is going to stay the same. One can't assume that Taiwan people at some point won't decide that maybe we should just accept reality and get the best deal that we can. Now, the stated US policy is that it's in our interest that the differences between the two sides of the strait are resolved peacefully and in accordance with the wishes of people on both sides of the strait, which really means in accordance with the wishes of the people of Taiwan, since they're the only people who get to express their views. The implication of that view is that if the Taiwan people decide that that's in their best interest, that it's not for us to stop them as long as it happens peacefully and without coercion. What an administration would do if it had a very different view of the strategic landscape in Asia, I don't know. But in this case, Taiwan has a certain amount of agency.
Chris Wagner, who is a student at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, has asked the question, what is your assessment of the possibility of a physical presence of the US military in Taiwan? And so I'm going to throw that one first to you, Mike. Would this provoke a response from China? Are there any circumstances in which the US should consider that option?
There are, of course, US military personnel in Taiwan. They just have a different status as part of AIT. So I think what Chris is asking about is if the US had a presence like we have in Japan or Korea with a base. There are other scenarios. There's the places not bases model with the Philippines. There's the visiting forces agreement we have with Manila, and then there's the Changi Pier strategic framework agreement we have with Singapore to have access. So there's many gradations. I think the main purpose in a Taiwan context of a U.S. military presence would be as a tripwire, frankly, that the presence of U.S. troops guarantees the U.S. would be pulled into a conflict, which is a large part of the reason why we have troops in Korea. It's not the only reason, but it's a big part of it. And if you think about it from that context, there are other ways to convince Beijing that use of force will lead to consequences, short of inserting troops. And so I think I guess I would say, I would never have answered this question if I were in government, but since we're in the think tank and we can do hypotheticals, I don't see a lot of utility to the United States of putting bases in Taiwan. And let's remember, most of the threat to Taiwan from China is gray zone coercion. It's not attack, it's cyber, it's intimidation, it's closing Taiwan's international space. And the best response to gray zone coercion, which is not kinetic in most cases, it's not use of force, is to have a broad repertoire that we can draw from. And it includes economic issues. And so, a trade agreement, a bilateral investment treaty with Taiwan is a powerful deterrent in a way and reassurance. It's not military and it's diplomatic. And a really critical part of cost imposition in a gray zone strategy is getting other like-minded states to impose a cost for coercion against Taiwan. Japan is more likely to do it than, say, Germany. But to the extent you have radiating concentric circles of consequences, China will be more deterred. If the U.S. Moves too quickly with something like strategic clarity or with bases in Taiwan, in a gray zone scenario, you're less likely to get support from other countries. You have to calibrate to some extent. So I see it as actually not very helpful. Now, if you're looking at an actual threat, a very palpable, real, imminent threat of military force, I personally could imagine an administration considering deploying Marines. Or other palpable measures that the United States will respond. But that's in an extreme scenario. And I think it would be an enormous debate within the administration. But that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about gray zone coercion, where U.S. unilateral steps that leave behind close allies like Japan or potential partners in Europe or Australia, that hurts us. It doesn't help us. So it's really not something that should be on the table for now. But in the kind of hypothetical scenarios down the future, yeah, I could see. I've been in scenario games out of government where the U.S. government considered that. Experienced policymakers thought, gee, maybe we need to set a clear deterrent message. And that's kind of what the Marines are for sometimes.
I see a couple of problems with this idea. First of all, in terms of the defense of Taiwan with U.S. help, it's very important that the Taiwan military be able to hold on for weeks or months before we can arrive in full force. And keeping the nose of the Taiwan military to that grindstone is not easy. if we were to decide to deploy troops to Taiwan, they would say, oh, our job's over. The United States is going to ensure our safety. We don't need to spend more on defense. We don't need to improve our reserves, et cetera, et cetera. The other bigger problem goes back to the 1970s. And one of the conditions that the PRC set for the normalization of relations with the United States was the withdrawal of US troops and installations from Taiwan. So if we were now to decide to deploy troops to Taiwan, I suspect that Beijing would feel great pressure to suspend or cancel diplomatic relations with the United States because we had destroyed one of the fundamental principles on which the establishment of diplomatic relations was based.
I know we're at the hour, Bonnie. Can I add one more wrinkle at the end on this question?
Okay, go ahead.
I agree with Richard, by the way, I was answering hypothetically in a future scenario where we're talking about imminent use of force, and this would be one possible option. I think in the foreseeable future, it carries more negative complications, including for Taiwan's security, than helpful additions to our security. And Richard, explained those well. But consider this: if there is a serious Taiwan Straits crisis, the U.S. AIT director, as an ambassador in other countries, would have to decide whether or not to do a non-combatant evacuation operation. And when you do a NEO, it's the U.S. Marines and the Air Force and the Navy that does it. So this is not a completely hypothetical or theoretical question. And I think it's a matter of policy. Richard hit it exactly right. It does not help us, but it is, it is not completely out of the impossible in future scenarios. Those are the scenarios we want to avoid, which is why in our report we focus so much on the Indo-Pacific Deterrence Initiative and U.S. capabilities and funding that legislation, and Taiwan's capability set and improving in cyber. These are all hypothetical. We don't want to ever be there, which is why the focus really has to be on some of the things in the report.
So we have reached the end of our hour, and I apologize for not getting to all of the questions, but we did address a number of them, and I think it's been a really rich discussion. I hope that all of you will go to csis.org, download our report, and read it. It has some very rich discussion about all of the challenges that Taiwan faces and U.S. policy, and discusses where we should go forward. In addition to the analysis and the recommendations, there are some great appendices. There is a list of US-Taiwan defense dialogues, which has not been really listed anywhere publicly before. There's a very good section in the appendix also on recent legislation pertaining to Taiwan, some of the binding and non-binding language, and a list of about a decade plus long of major arms sales that we've made to Taiwan. So thank you again for joining us. And on behalf of my co-chairs, Mike Green and Richard Bush, really appreciate everybody joining us. And again, thank you so much to all of the members of the task force for their contributions to what has, I think, turned out to be a really meaningful project and product. Thanks again.